I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. Iran earlier today fired close to 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. Here to explain this breaking development in the Middle East is Janatan Sayeh. He is a research analyst at FDD. Janatan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the headline news. Iran fired roughly 200, a little less than, reports are saying about 180, ballistic missiles at Israel today. What do we know, and is the attack over at this point in time?
So the first thing that we know is the regime media outlets are claiming that about 180 Fatah hypersonic missiles were launched. So what is different about this round of attacks compared to that of April is that, number one, even though the attack seems like it is smaller in scale, the numbers seem to be less than 320. I think it was in April. Right now is around 180. The projectiles themselves are very different this time. So in April, most of the projectiles were, as well as hypersonic missiles, there were also cruise missiles, short range, as well as drones being launched both from Iran and from neighboring countries. With this attack, what we've seen so far is that the regime is claiming that these are hypersonic missiles launched from Iran. We yet don't know whether regime proxies in the region have also aided the attack. We know Hezbollah may have launched a few. We don't know if Islamic Resistance Iraq or Houthis in Yemen have came to Tehran's aid this time around.
Interesting. So what you're saying is, for those who have been following the news closely since April and even before, don't pay as much attention to the headline number of missiles, but instead look at the type of missiles that were fired today?
Correct. Depending on the type of missile, Israel would activate a different form of anti-missile or anti-aircraft defense system. So in this context, Israel would not be using the Iron Dome that it oftentimes does when it comes to rockets being launched from Lebanon, and therefore has to use other defense system capabilities when it comes to hypersonic missiles, assuming regime claims are actually true, that these are in fact Fatah missiles.
Let's talk about what provoked today's attack. Earlier this week, Israel invaded southern Lebanon to attack Hezbollah. This seems connected to that. Can you talk about the state of relations between Israel, Iran, and Lebanon over the last day to week?
The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, effectively one of the Islamic Republic's strongest military wings, stated earlier today that this was in response to not just the latest attacks in Lebanon, but what they highlighted, what the regime highlighted, is Israel's targeting of Haniya and Tehran, as well as the killing, of course, the targeted assassination of former Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, as well as other target assassinations that have taken place around the Middle East, in Lebanon, in Syria, and of course in the capital of Iran. As a whole, the regime has been more or less reluctant, or has shown to an extent restraint when it comes to responding to Israeli attacks. According to them, it was about time for them to respond, and it was perhaps a more comprehensive response to multiple waves of attacks against what the regime sees as their main elements in the region. More broadly speaking, another reason perhaps the regime had this tactic in mind is that in the face of their supporters, both inside Iran and in the region, they had not expressed or shown or followed up with the threats that they have made throughout the months before. So it also holds to an extent a propaganda campaign for their support base. We know that was the case in April. Depending on how many casualties, if any casualties, Israelis report, we can perhaps conclude that this may have been more to show face and save face in front of their own supporters.
I see. So this might be a messaging attack and not necessarily an escalation into a full-scale war?
That would depend on, like I said, the number of casualties. But oftentimes, when the strategy is to perhaps send a message or to perhaps use psychological warfare, oftentimes the regime, as they did in April, there are weeks and weeks of threats coming from numerous officials, different ranks, supreme leader, all the way to local RGC commanders issuing threats about, we're going to take out Israel, we're going to target Haifa or Tel Aviv. This time around, what is very different is that we did not see those messages coming from the Islamic Republic's leaders. So perhaps if the psychological warfare strategy was in place, it would have been more likely for us to see more and more and perhaps weeks of rhetoric coming from Tehran, whereas this time around, the regime responded rather rapidly without issuing many threats. We know for a fact that the supreme leader right now is in hiding. He might be leading the Friday prayer this weekend, but we don't know that for a fact. So this time around, it seems like their strategy is shifting a bit. Perhaps it was more targeted, and they sought to eliminate more military infrastructure. That's the claim. I think we have to find out once more information comes from Israel.